Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first official trip to Asia was to attend the ASEAN conference in Kuala Lumpur. That is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And the plan was to reaffirm the United States' commitment to advancing a free, open, and secure Indo-Pacific region. Of course, this is a key area of U.S. competition with China and great power competition more broadly. However, President Trump had just taken several steps to really ramp up the pressure on both U.S. partners and allies in the region. He had announced plans to impose tariffs on several ASEAN countries. The State Department laid off dozens of officials working in the Indo-Pacific while Secretary Rubio was on his trip. And the Trump administration had also announced that it was launching a review of AUKUS, the huge nuclear submarine deal between the US, UK, and Australia. And of course, he's also dismantled US aid and has paused lots of US foreign assistance in the region. So we are here today to discuss if President Trump's trade and security strategies are aligned in the Indo-Pacific. Are the steps the administration has taken likely to increase US power in the region, or could they backfire? And what do they mean for the United States' broader strategy in the Indo-Pacific? So today I am joined by two of our leading experts on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Charles Edel is our Australia chair, and he's just back from Down Under. G'day, Charlie.
That's some pronunciation you have, Will. Nice to be back here.
Have you picked up any new Aussie slang?
I'm mad as a cut snake. I could go on.
What does that mean?
I'm not sure, but they say it a lot.
How would we know if he's making these up?
Look, the worst, as we all know, is the American who not only uses every localism that they can, but then pronounces it in the right way. So we're going to stick to a straight-up American East Coast, New York City accent.
When an American spends a week in Australia and starts saying, how you going, instead of how you doing, stop it.
I will just note, though, that oftentimes in the Edel household, items, particularly like school items for the boys, go walkabout. Silence. People are trying to decipher, at least Will, is what that means.
No, I think I do know what that means. I think we use that too. So Greg Poling is the director of both the Southeast Asia program and also the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. Greg, you've not come from quite so far, but I understand you live outside Baltimore. Do you have any Baltimore slang for us?
None that's appropriate for the podcast.
Okay, great. Well, let me get into it. So I want to start with the security piece. Is it fair to say that the pressure the Trump administration is putting on U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific is unprecedented when it comes to security? I mentioned the kind of AUKUS review. I think there's pressure on the Philippines as well as it relates to security and China. Is this very unusual? Is this a new kind of strategy for a U.S. administration to be pursuing?
No. I'll just start with that. The method which the administration is going about it seems unprecedented over the last couple of years, but for the last multiple decades, the United States has wanted its allies and its partners to do more to help solve collective security challenges. Now, the form in which the pressure comes toggles back and forth. So, if we look at the last administration, the Biden administration, I think the proposition was we're going to throw our arms around our allies and to a certain extent our partners and say, how much more can we do together? Because the security challenges that we face have really changed in an unprecedented fashion. When you get to the Trump administration, it's the tough love, sometimes minus the love approach. I think when you step back from this, Will, to a certain degree, if you just take one approach without the other, you have a problem. But that said, the toggling back and forth from one to the other can be a bit disorienting for allies. The most important point here, at least from my perspective, is in allied capitals, in partner capitals too, the challenge is disaggregating Donald Trump from what's actually happening in the region. That is, Donald Trump becomes a domestic political issue in Australia, in New Zealand, in the Philippines, in Japan, clearly, because no country will make decisions simply because Donald Trump yells at you to make decisions. But the question is whether or not these countries can undertake the needed defense, security reforms that the situation warrants. And you hear consistently all over the region that what we're seeing is unprecedented, a security situation that has changed in such marked ways where the Chinese has plowed resources into not only the development, but then the more sort of use of their military. And the question is not whether you're a good or an ally based on are you spending X percent of GDP, but are you spending enough as compared to those who do you harm? So that's really where the conversation is at.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I'd note that the Philippines is an interesting exception here. The Philippines is the only U.S. ally anywhere on Earth, I would say, that's been relatively happy with almost all the rhetoric they've gotten from the Trump administration on the security front. There hasn't been any explicit demand yet from DOD or the White House for the Philippines to raise defense spending. They got the first visit by Secretary Hegseth to the Indo-Pacific, also the first visit by his Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Southeast Asia. You know, the Philippines, I think the conceptual box the Philippines fits into for many in the administration is different than the other allies. The Philippines is not, in their mind, an ally who's not doing enough, who's free riding on the U.S. The Philippines is a David standing up to Goliath, and so is a sympathetic character, one that is actually doing, at least for now, I think, as much as can be hoped. Also, it's not one that a lot of the administration pays that much attention to. They don't have a lot of preconceived notions about the Philippines the way they do Japan or Korea or certainly our European allies. I'm not confident that will last in perpetuity, but for now, Manila's been getting off pretty easily compared to every other U.S. treaty ally.
And Charlie, at the start, I mentioned this AUKUS review. Is this being overblown, or is that really serious? And are people in Australia taking this very seriously?
Answer, maybe. Look, so the AUKUS review, just in case people who are listening aren't tracking, is there was a story that came out in the FT about a month ago that the Department of Defense, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, was conducting a review of AUKUS. This then kind of set off the papers, the commentary in Australia about, is the United States about to junk AUKUS? Then there was another round of commentary saying, well, is the U.S. not about to junk AUKUS, but laden it with additional burdens, be it, tying it to more defense spending by the Aussies, a pre-commitment to defend Taiwan regardless of circumstances. And as you might imagine, this has really kind of kicked off a debate inside of Australia. So, look, taking a step back, I think we can say at the outset that it is totally, so my opinion is, it's totally usual for a major initiative to be reviewed by an incoming administration. And in fact, because this is something that's extended from administration to administration intra-party in the UK and in Australia, and in fact, now in the US too, the Brits conducted their own review of AUKUS. The Australians, which they don't talk about too much, have conducted their own internal review. It's not a public review. Advice has been delivered to government. The only country that hasn't conducted a review is the United States. So this makes eminent sense. And frankly, AUKUS has outsized ambitions. I think the prospect of what might achieve really is, game-changing. But it also has a lot of questions that it hasn't answered, and some of the things that have been talked about for AUKUS haven't come online as quickly or as well as administrations want. So a policy review is no problem whatsoever. The question is, what else is this being linked to? We know that the Trump administration will look for leverage on any negotiation, so this is therefore leverage because it matters to the Australians a lot. So what else is this intended to be?
And I think one of the other parts of this conversation has been a discussion about asking Australia to commit to use those submarines in defense of Taiwan in a future situation in which China invades Taiwan. Is that right? Is part of this linked to pressure on China and the U.S. strategy against China?
Well, if we believe the reports that are coming out, yes, that has come up as well. And it's not an Australia alone conversation because the Japanese have also gotten this question. Actually, the Japanese have gotten both questions, both about how quickly are you going to rise? We're going to ask you to rise more than the percentage you committed to. And what are you going to do when the chips are down on Taiwan, even though the United States itself won't say what it will do when the chips are down? Look, that's a very pointed question, as you might imagine. It's really sensitive within Australian, within Japanese politics, too. But it's not a crazy question to ask quietly behind the scenes for allies and partners to clarify expectations, nor for America to push its allies to be willing to lean more into contingencies. Do you have a different take on that, looking at this from Southeast Asia, or just your own perspective, Craig?
I think that the argument here, at least as applied to the allies, including the Philippines and Japan and Australia, is maybe the distinction between asking what will you do if China invades Taiwan versus what will you do if the United States comes to Taiwan's aid. Because the language of the ANZUS Treaty between the U.S. and Australia is identical to the language of the U.S.-Philippine MDT. There's no legal wiggle room here. If Americans are fighting and dying anywhere in the Pacific area, Australians are legally and morally obligated to respond, just like Filipinos are. But that's not the same as knuckling down on allied leaders and asking them, will you come to Taiwan's defense with absolutely no caveats, even if Taiwan were to declare independence unilaterally? Because, as you said, those are commitments that the U.S. government itself will not make. So why would Canberra or Tokyo or Manila make those commitments?
Right. I mean, you hear, I'm sure you've had these conversations when you're talking about Philippines and how things are evolving there. But, you know, as a think tank expert, you don't want to appear to give the same, not boring, just important talking points that you get from government officials. But it's true. You're not going to answer a contingency or a hypothetical before it happens because it's all about what, when, under what circumstances. But on the other hand, the point is to make sure that the Philippines, Japan, Australia, the United States don't have to respond, which is, therefore, the strategic question is, what can you do in advance of that to help stabilize a situation that's been really badly destabilized?
Zooming out a bit, is there any risk that any of these moves that the Trump administration has taken on the security side could backfire and actually end up pushing some of these countries, whether partners or allies in the region, more towards China? I mean, we saw the Australian Prime Minister just had a week-long trip to China. Perhaps it's unfair to talk about that in the context of the question I've just asked, but I'm interested if you think there could be any unintended consequences in the security realm here.
No, I don't think that there's much chance of the Trump administration doing anything that pushes any of the allies strategically closer to China. Of course, everybody will seek their own pragmatic balance on the economic relationship, on diplomacy. But the threat perception, the view that China is a destabilizing, revisionist actor, is shared now by the overwhelming majority of both publics and elites in every U.S. treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific: Australia, Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. Apologies to our friends in Thailand. My concern would not be, is the U.S. going to push them closer to China? Because these are autonomous actors that make their own decisions based on their own national interest. And their national interest is in pushing back and balancing against China. But it will push them into more strategic autonomy from the United States, more networking with each other and with European partners, which can be good, but it also means that the U.S. post-Trump administration is going to find that it has considerably less leverage over the decision-making of every one of its allies globally than it did before the Trump administration.
I largely agree with that. I would say, though, that the pushing, as hard as it is, could have a very useful outcome, right? I mean, on defense spending, it could have a useful outcome, as I think we've seen in the European case, whether or not that gets transferred. However, there's this tricky issue of domestic politics in each of the individual countries. And again, we talked about this a second ago, whether or not sovereign countries will make decisions because they are being yelled at, screamed at, told they have to do more, as opposed to decisions they make on their own. So my concern when I watch this is that the challenge, the threat perception, I think, is much more aligned than it was 5 years ago, than it was 10 years ago. So you'll continue to see the direction of travel kind of run on parallel lines. But I think it might be slower than it otherwise would. And I think the collective heft of what the United States does together with its other allies and stitching them together will be less than the sum of its parts otherwise. The final point, though, I find really interesting about strategic autonomy. So there's a rip-roaring debate in Australia right now. It's not just Australia, but I'm pretty focused on that one about, well, we're over-leveraged on the Americans. America looks a little bit more mercurial, so we need to have the ability to do more ourselves, which makes some sense, certainly from an Australian perspective. But then the second question is, if you want to pursue strategic autonomy, do you actually have the means to pursue strategic autonomy? And are you willing to put up the resources for that? So in Australia, this is oftentimes a question of to AUKUS or to not AUKUS, but it's a much broader question than that because Australia buys almost all of their military capabilities, their kit, from America, or at least component parts of this. So the question is, if you don't like what the United States is doing and you're sitting in Canberra or you're sitting in Wellington or sitting in Tokyo or you're sitting in Seoul, are you willing to invest the amount in your own defense capabilities where you have more autonomy? And thus far, the conversation in Australia is nowhere near that. So the debate is they're at about 2.03% of GDP. They're talking about sending it up to 2.33% within the decade. I think for serious, sober defense analysts, when we begin to talk about individual capabilities for Australia, we would be talking around the range of 6 to 8% of their GDP, which is not politically feasible or realistic. So strategic autonomy is something that's being more discussed than acted on, I would say.
At the risk of continuing to hijack Will's podcast, one of the things I think we're getting to here, and that we'll talk about more on the econ side, is we have this binary vision that what is good for China is bad for the U.S. and vice versa. And I think we vastly underestimate the ability of allies and partners to just say a pox on both your houses, that both of you are equally destabilizing, or perhaps not equally, but both are destabilizing and require a degree of rebalancing. We saw this during COVID. Net, both the U.S. and China became less popular across the entire Indo-Pacific for different reasons, but neither won the PR battle during COVID. Both lost equally. And that's what I think we're most likely to see again under the Trump administration.
Well, I want to piggyback on that and continue hijacking Will's wonderful podcast.
You don't have anywhere to be, right?
So the question is, in Manila, you said they've largely escaped the eye of Sauron from Washington thus far.
On the security
front. But what is the actual security conversation in Manila looking like now? How has it shifted? Are they putting more resources towards it? Is there a debate about more strategic autonomy in Manila?
So there's not a lot of conversation about increasing the overall percentage of GDP because it's constitutionally impossible. The Philippines requires that the state spend more on education and I think healthcare than it does on military, on defense budget. So for a developing country that just missed by a few bucks becoming upper middle income this year, it's not possible to substantially increase the budget. Now, there is talk about shifting things, particularly from internal security to external defense, and networking more with other allies and partners. You're seeing a wholehearted embrace of a lot of the modernization in the U.S.-Philippine alliance, but you're also seeing a pretty rapid advance in the diversification of Philippine security ties. We've had the long-standing Philippine-Australia status of forces agreement. Now you have another one with Japan signed a year and a half ago. You have one with New Zealand and Canada, both inked this year, which are about to be ratified. And France's is sitting on the desk of the Department of National Defense. So, the Philippines is not in a position to jettison the American alliance. But the Philippines is trying to make sure it's got a lot more friends than just the Americans.
Okay. I do want to try and take back the reins of this conversation. And good luck, Will. Bring us to the economic piece, because particularly on tariffs, I think this has played out probably much more starkly for a lot of these countries. So to start off, Greg, I'm going to start with a quick fire round where I say a Southeast Asian country, and I want you to say what the current tariff rate is.
I have to remember what they were on April 1st and what they were as of the new letters.
And August 1st. There you go, Greg.
No, I'm joking.
I think I get
really. There are a lot of different numbers for different countries, and I think they have responded quite differently. We already see the first deals. So what I would love to hear from you is, kind of collectively speaking, have the reactions of Southeast Asian countries to the tariff threat sort of surprised you? Are they playing out in an interesting way? Or is this going kind of as you think the Trump administration planned?
I don't think it's going the way the Trump administration planned, because the Trump administration expected to have 170-ish deals by now. It's going pretty much how I expected and how I think a lot of people expected. After April 1st, you had a meeting by the ASEAN finance ministers that issued this joint statement that ASEAN, the South Asian nations, was going to adopt a unified approach to try to push back against the Americans. And I didn't believe that, and I don't think anybody in South Asia believed that. And what you saw is while they said that, several of them started rushing to Washington to try to cut bilateral deals, because at the end of the day, the comparative advantages of most of the most quickly growing states of South Asia are identical. They are their closest competitors, right? Vietnam is not trying to work in solidarity with the Philippines or Malaysia or Indonesia. It is trying to make sure that it is more competitive than them. And what the threatened tariffs on April 1st did was wildly throw off balance that, those comparative advantages. So you had Vietnam given a 46% tariff. Cambodia got the second highest tariff in the world at 49%. How can they possibly compete with the Philippines, which was given 17% at the time? So it's not surprising me at all that Vietnam got the second framework agreement after the UK, because it is probably the country on earth, along with Cambodia, I think, that was facing the greatest existential threat from the tariffs. And that difference in the threat perception and the fact that they're all competitors meant that any hope of a united South Asian front here was impossible from the start.
Charlie, my sense is that tariffs perhaps aren't having quite as big an effect on the part of the world that you focus on Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, but that there, the much greater threat has been the dismantling of US aid and the freezing of lots of US foreign assistance. And I know you have a new report out that looks into this specifically and looks at the national security implications of the US drawdown in the Pacific. So is there an opening for China in this? Is that overstated? And is this really a huge concern for these countries, the steps that the Trump administration has taken on foreign aid?
Yep, we have a new report out today about the effects, the implications, the national security implications of the American drawdown in the Pacific. And that's partially tariffs. We should point out, too, that there are only 2 countries have a trade surplus with the U.S., Fiji and Tuvalu. The rest all run deficits with the U.S.
This is you're talking about just in the region, in the Southern Pacific.
That's right. Of the 17 nations, there are only 2. But it's the kind of double, if not triple whammy of the USAID wind down / folding into State Department / decapitation, however you want to talk about it, combined with the tariffs that have really been a hit to these very, very small countries across the South Pacific at the same time that China has ramped up its presence, at the same time that the United States had been trying over the last couple of years to get back in the game of being a more consistent partner. And so I think the impact, the implications are that it makes it quite hard for the United States to make the point that we are consistently here as a partner for these nations. Again, these are very small nations, but they have outsized strategic implications for access to the region, for military installations, and for other things like democracy promotion, too. So the outcome of where the U.S. has gone on tariffs, the kind of slashing of USAID programming and development assistance has had devastating effect across the Southern Pacific.
And is that then creating an opening for China? Is that what we're seeing in Southeast Asia as well?
I think it creates an opening for China's PR machine, for China to try to make up some normative ground. I don't think that there's much chance of China filling the ODA, the official development assistance gap, because this isn't what China does. I mean, yes, China is the probably second or third, depending on whose numbers you look at these days, provider of development assistance, but not the kind of development assistance provided by the U.S. and Europe that's also pulling back in the region. You're not going to see China providing, support for hospitals on the Myanmar-Thailand border or helping with antibiotic resistance, TB, and malaria in the region. So those needs just then go unmet. And I suspect the answer is the same. But in Southeast Asia, the biggest problem has not been the level of funding cuts. It's been the wanton callousness and lack of process, right? to a not insignificant number of people in South Asia are dead today that would not have died without these cuts, particularly in places like the southern Philippines and the Thai-Myanmar border. And it's because you can't throw somebody off a ventilator because you defunded their hospital and then say, don't worry, state's going to pick up the bill in a year. You could have gone until the end of the contract year. You could have let people find alternative sources of funding. Instead, you decided to just let the chips fall. You know, who cares how many new babies get HIV who didn't have to? Who cares how many hospitals have to close?
So I have been criticized in the past by a listener that a quick fire round of questions at the end was not actually that quick. So I'm going to bring out my phone and I'm going to give you 15 seconds each. Maximum.
It sounds like you aren't criticized, Will, but our very chatty colleagues are being criticized.
Well, luckily, we have not been combative or ignoring his directions during this podcast.
Okay, so my first question is, can you sum up Trump's strategy in the Indo-Pacific in one word?
No.
Contradictory.
That was it? Okay.
Yeah, I give my word too.
Okay, great. I didn't even start my timer. Okay, number 2, who is up and who's down the most this week in the Indo-Pacific out of the US, China, and Russia? I guess probably not Russia, but of the US and China.
Upmost is the U.S. if we see an announcement in the next 2 hours that there's a trade deal with the Philippines.
Yes, and we're recording this on Tuesday, the 22nd at 10 a.m., so we might have to do 2 versions of this depending on how that meeting goes.
Down the most this week, I guess, is Russia.
Okay.
For no real reason. It's just,
okay,
nothing's gone wrong for China this week that I'm aware of in the region.
So I'll give you the flip of that because we still don't know the outcome of what's going to happen with the Philippines. So China looks up to me, as you alluded to earlier in our conversation. The Australian Prime Minister just went for a 6-day trip, signing a lot of deals, intent-on deals, kind of opening up tourism, promoting more trade. To me, this is like a great PR coup for China. The Aussies are totally aware of this.
5 seconds.
This is not a quick answer, by the way.
5 seconds.
I want to note it. I want a yellow card. Pull that right now.
I'm stunned. Yeah, I'll just say that this is like one of the periodic moments where China pretends to be an open economy. So the Aussies are making hay out of this, but China looks up to me at this point.
Okay, so on the security side, I think you've both described tough love that the US is showing to its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. But I think you provided some context here and said it's not actually unprecedented. The AUKUS review is not unprecedented. And the way in which, you know, some of these other forms of pressure are playing out is not that unusual. Perhaps it's the way in which it's being it's being implemented is what's more unusual here. But I don't think either of you see a real risk of these strategies pushing allies strategically closer to China. Although the threat perception of China is widely shared, it's more aligned than it has been for a while. But the collective heft of the US pushing is perhaps lessened. On the economic side, no real solidarity between Southeast Asian states, different threat perceptions causing a more bilateral approach. And then I think, Charlie, you've pointed out how stark these aid cuts are, and Greg actually as well, and that it is harder for the US to show that it's there as a partner for lots of these countries. Maybe China is trying to seize on this from a PR perspective, but it's not truly creating opportunities for China that China's going to seize on, but that the haphazard way in which some of these foreign aid cuts have been executed have had real consequences for a lot of people in this part of the world. So I think then the answer is the trade and security policies are somewhat aligned. They're not as contradictory as I expected you to say, but they're certainly not, this doesn't come across to lots of these countries in the region as a very coherent strategy that they're trying to deal with.
I was just going to say different emphasis. I think they are. I mean, my one-word answer was contradictory, because the impetus is to get people to do more on the security themselves, to have more collective heft together, while at the same time pushing on the economic side, making it harder for those to happen. So I actually think there's some cognitive dissonance here. Let
me just ruin the structure of the program and note that I think that is right for the allies, but the only ally in South Asia is the Philippines. I think there is a clear and probably generational damage being done to U.S. standing in the rest of Southeast Asia outside of the Philippines that will make it a heck of a lot harder for future U.S. administrations to get the non-aligned states of the global South and Southeast Asia to vote our way on issues of importance.
Greg, Charlie, thank you so much.
No, wait, we're going to hijack you again. You haven't asked us, like, what one phrase we want to, like, I've been dying to say this.
We also didn't talk about the fact that we have an Australian politician nominated to be the next MAGA influencer / ambassador to Malaysia.
That's right.
Okay, final thing then. What word are you banning from pundits from saying, Charlie?
With clear eyes. It's a particular bugbear of mine that with clear eyes, or to be clear as a phrase, means that you appear to be even-handed even as you take whatever you are going to do and throw it on the bus. I hate it. I'm sure I've used it 1,500 times in my writing. I want to ban it.
Okay, Greg.
I just said it, but I hate the term Global South.
Okay.
I think it confuses our arguments about what we actually mean when what we're talking about is non-alignment, not a development level.
Well, thank you so much. Look forward to having you back, even if you made my job very difficult.
That's what we're here for.
Good day, Will.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.